Welcome to the Democracies College podcast series. This podcast focuses on educational equity, justice, and excellence for all students in the P through 20 educational pathways. This podcast is a product of the Office of Community College Research and Leadership, or OCCRL, at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Learn more about OCCRL at occrl.illinois.edu.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us on another episode of Democracies College. My name is Heather McCambly. I'm an assistant professor of higher education at the University of Pittsburgh and also a research affiliate with the Office of Community College Research and Leadership. This is our fourth podcast episode in conversation with authors featured in the volume Critiques for Transformation, Reimagining Colleges and Communities for Social Justice, edited by myself and Dr. Lorenzo Weber. I'm joined today by Dr. Erin Doran and Dr. Sergio Gonzalez. Dr. Erin Doran is an associate professor at the School of Education at Iowa State University with a particular focus in community college research. Her work has been published in the Journal of Hispanic Higher Education, Journal of Latinos and Education, and the Journal of Diversity in Higher Education, among other places. She is the author of the chapter at the center of today's discussion, Untapped Potential, Ethnic Studies in Community Colleges. Welcome, Erin. And Dr. Sergio Gonzalez is an assistant professor at the Department of Educational Foundations and Leadership in the School of Education at Duquesne University. He teaches undergraduate and graduate level coursework in higher ed, emphasizing social justice discourses. His interdisciplinary research is informed by women of color feminisms, Chicana Latina feminisms, and Joteria studies with higher education scholarship. To get us started, I wanted to ask a fun warm-up question where you tell one of your secrets. So I want to ask you, what is your secret or not so secret writing procrastination activity?
Oh, if I'm cleaning my bathrooms, there's a deadline that is looming that I am really, really running away from.
Oh my God, I'm in the similar boat. If I'm folding my socks and my chonies, you know that like I'm trying to do everything but what I need to do, because you open the drawers and you're like, why is this even color coded? Because I'm trying to avoid life.
That's a lot.
Writing.
I thought you were going to go with the makeup brushes.
No, because that's like relaxing. But when I'm like hella stressed out, I'll start like folding like laundry like to the T.
I mean, y'all's are responsible. My version is actually deeply shameful. It's all celebrity gossip. I will just...
I mean, it's productive procrastination. Productive procrastination is still procrastination.
True. Yeah. Well, mine is unproductive procrastination. So,
you know what, though? So when I was working on my master's, like in a whole nother life, I was a scholar who was studying the Holocaust, and the stuff that I would read about genocide, about war and stuff like that, like Us magazine was my haven because it was just something that was necessary for me to turn my brain off, that was completely like superficial and light and whatever. So like I never ever judge people when they're like, I'm into like Bravo TV and People magazine, like go get it.
Okay, well, I'm glad we have that in common. It's not just me. Okay, so now that we've revealed our deepest secrets here, Erin, I wanted to start by inviting you just to share a bit about the origin story of the chapter from the book. So what drove you to write about ethnic studies in community colleges? And specifically, how did that come together for this volume?
Around 2015, when I was still in Texas, first off, I have a number of friends who teach Mexican American studies, which is what the field is called in Texas, who teach Mexican American studies in community colleges in the San Antonio area in particular. And in 2015, there had been a really, really problematic / racist textbook that had been put forward to the Texas state legislature for adoption for the K-12 curriculum for the high school, actually, I should say, not K-12, but high school curriculum for Mexican American studies. And it had mobilized a lot of ethnic studies instructors and then just folks who maybe aren't nested within an ethnic studies department at their respective institutions, but like may teach Latino history or Latino literature or something like that. So within the San Antonio community, there was like this grassroots community that had grown of scholar practitioners, teachers, scholars called Somos Más, or We Are More, like a play on Más on Mexican American studies. But the thing that was really interesting to me is that the community college students in the area were also mobilized as well to like organize caravans to drive to Austin, which is about 75 miles north of where they were, in the middle of the summer to go attend these textbook hearings at the legislature, to go testify and things like that. It was just, for me, like, what is so compelling or provocative about these programs that you've got students who are like busy, who are taking time off of work, who are taking time away from their families to like go and get really involved in this process, which is usually not as fraught as this particular one was. And so that was what really sparked like my intellectual curiosity in it and what started me getting involved in doing research in this area. As far as the chapter goes, I know that Lorenzo knew that this was what I was studying. We had a lot of conversations informally about it when our offices were next door to each other at Iowa State. And I feel like Lorenzo, having this background of like a mother who is a scholar activist, like someone who has been very passionate about African American studies, knowing some of our foremost Black scholars and stuff like that, I think he could understand and appreciate what I was sort of going through as a scholar who was studying my own respective ethnic studies field. So he asked me, do you want to contribute a chapter? And I remember the thing that was weighing very heavily on my heart as I was starting to write this chapter was the El Paso shooting had just happened. I was born and raised in El Paso. The Walmart that happened in is next to a mall that my mom goes to, like usually every Saturday. I think the thing actually that saved my like mental health that day was the fact that my mom actually like called me first to say like, this happened. I wasn't there. Don't panic. And so like, I remember reaching out to Lorenzo and was like, I think I'm going to talk about El Paso in this chapter. And he was just like, do it. And so for me, that ended up being something that I could sort of process the grief that I was feeling personally, and to just also like go back to this question of like, why are we here as educators? Like, why are we here? What are we hoping that we can do for students by delivering the content, the knowledge, by sharing the experiences that we do in the classrooms? And what is the ultimate goal of ethnic studies, I think, in helping students grapple with like who they are, what it means to be a minoritized person in American society. And that's why I think it's like I also tried to draw on there are community colleges in every community across the United States, or there's one nearby. So whether we're talking about poverty or settler colonialism or white supremacy or what have you, there are community colleges that can educate and that can provide students with some sort of space for how to deal with these issues and what they want to think about for themselves regarding these issues. And so that, I think, is the sort of meta narrative of like what brought me to this research in the first place, but what also motivated me to write what I wrote in this chapter.
Thank you for sharing that. That's like really powerful. So I read the chapter and I was like, oh my God, there were so many points that like I really resonated with. And I was like, I think that in the future, if you ever like decide to expand on this, which I think you totally could, I would include that as like a vignette, because I think that brought it full circle. Like reading that and then hearing this, I was like, oh, that makes so much sense. That's so powerful. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the question about origin stories for our research is something that we don't ask each other enough. How did you come to the research that you dedicated a lot of time and effort and headspace to and stuff like that? Like, I love hearing about people's origin stories. I came up from a master's program where my mentor always said, like, research is me-search, that all research is fundamentally me-search, and that you're looking for yourself in some way, whether or not you realize it at the time. Like, your curiosities are taking you down some way that is connected to yourself, your ancestors, like whatever, some sort of personal story. And so I do love that question.
And it makes me think about, I think, what we're grappling with as a field with the idea of what positionality statements are for, too. It's evolving. But I think for me, the ideal positionality statement will help us understand that kind of complex interweaving of the origin of this research in relation to who we are and what we've experienced, rather than the like list of identities. But it's like, what does that have to do with how you came to create what you created? And there's always a story behind every single one of these projects we pursue. And so, Sergio, I wanted to ask or invite you to kind of intersect what you've been thinking about with this chapter with your own work. And specifically, I'm just thinking now and tapping into the vitality of community colleges for this type of teaching and learning and opportunity that ethnic studies brings. And also, I would say like an extra resistance to it that we see come up in terms of like community colleges are for like practical, technical training. Like people don't need to be wasting their time on frou-frou extra types of learning. And what an interesting tension that is, in particular with the type of work that you do.
So I love this chapter. I was like highlighting, I color code my highlights. And so I was color coding like, oh, this is like for me to explore. And even like bringing up San Francisco State and like how that's where a lot of like ethnic studies really like started to like push out. I was like, yeah, I remember like growing up and like learning about this, right? But also understanding like the social context that I was in the Bay Area because that's where I'm from. And so I had that exposure. And so I think a lot about my time working at College Track as I was like going through this chapter. And so at College Track, I was a college success advisor. And so I worked with students for this nonprofit, which I was a part of. So when I was in high school, they helped me get into college and it was after school. They provided ACT prep, SAT prep. They provided academic advising. Everyone had like tutoring. And so they were able to like help with the academics. And through College Track and the work that I did when I came back home after undergrad, community colleges were like segues to college. It wasn't like it's community college or 4-year. That was the bigger spectrum of like how education was filtered to students. But we were like, you can take a community college class. And we would often be like, take an ethnic studies course so you can learn more about yourself and have a deeper understanding of the world that you exist in before you go to college. And so we were always using community college courses as a way to actually access courses. Where I'm from, we were part of like the Sequoia Union Public School District, right? So if we didn't have those AP or AS classes, the community college class could count as a course to like help us when we were applying to schools, right? It wasn't used as the like, oh, you're only going to community college. It was like your community college can provide you courses and context that are going to prepare you for when you do apply and go to college. It's kind of like beating the system, right? Like, A, you have college courses on your transcript. B, you're improving your GPA because they don't offer this class. So this is a way for you to like go above and beyond what resources existed for you to like educate yourself. So like we used a lot of the community college courses as a way to like, this is how you're gonna learn about yourself through ethnic studies, right? And I think that really impacted like me as I show up in education, right? And I always say I'm a scholar activist in the sense that I'm always thinking back to like, how am I engaging with community and for my community? And I always go back to like the communities that I'm from in the Bay Area. Being from the hood, being first generation, right? Like understanding that poverty was a huge factor into whether or not we did have access to school and who we were reading, why we were reading such people. And so I feel like as someone who is in education, as a scholar activist, I have a very interdisciplinary approach because I grab from other spaces, aka I grab a lot from ethnic studies. Like I don't grab from education and say, yeah, qualitative research methods 1 taught me. No, it didn't. Like in my academic upbringing, all of my research methods course were taken in women of color feminist classes. We're taking in like feminist research theory. And so I approach my work and like my rationale, even the classes I'm teaching here, I'm teaching social justice in higher ed. And every class we have to do a positionality statement. Like that's part of the course. And we go through it throughout the whole semester. So they just submitted their first draft and I'm going to provide feedback and I'm going to ask them to dig deeper and then they're going to work on it again. And by the end of the semester, I'm like, you're going to have a positionality statement that you could take with you and continue to evolve because you know, everything's going to change from the moment right here as a student to when you graduate. A lot of my students are going to be K through 12 educators. And so I want you to critically reflect on your why and what you're doing and who you're in community and conversation with and for.
That speaks to part of the writing that Lorenzo and I did in the intro, because we kind of had the opportunity to write the introduction chapter right at the end as this was about to come out. I think we got to do this, finalize that intro into 2021 late 2021. And so we were starting to catch the winds of how bad the political backlash was going to be to all of the renewed energy that went towards, the movement for Black lives and kind of other deep social concerns with race and racism. And we were starting to see, okay, this is how folks are going to mobilize against all of this ground we almost took, or we felt like maybe we took as communities. And so as we were writing, we were thinking about ethnic studies, for example, having a target on its back, kind of first and foremost. And as we were writing, really talking about the folks coming for ethnic studies, the anti-woke movement, folks on the far right, they're not doing this for no reason. They're not actually dumb. They're coming for ethnic studies and other types of groups and organizations because it matters and it actually does have impact on people's lives and development. So from the beginning, I was super excited about this chapter, Erin, but now it kind of takes on a almost like different valence. Last year, we had the Florida Governor, Ron DeSantis, laying out in his plan for higher ed, specifically slamming recent incorporations of critical anti-racist frameworks, as well as ethnic studies in general, saying things like, quote, the core curriculum must be grounded in actual history, the actual philosophy that has shaped Western civilization, end quote. So how are you both thinking kind of anew about ethnic studies and its role, particularly in community colleges, in light of the backlash we're seeing?
One thing that I have seen community college instructors, they've been very, very savvy in the ways that they have sort of legitimized ethnic studies. And I do realize that there's a lot of fair criticisms about when you become part of the academy, do you lose part of the soul of liberation of resistance and all of that stuff? There's a whole base of literature that's kind of outside the purview of what I'm saying, but I get it. But I think one of the things that for the community college instructors who have been gracious enough to share their experience with me, I think that they've gotten very savvy at making sure that they codify these classes into the core curriculum of the state. And they take it not just at the institutional or district level, they fought for it at the state level. In Texas, for instance, they sort of made it so you'd have to change Texas administrative code kind of thing. And I could be wrong. I may not be understanding the legislative process completely correctly, but they have made it so that these courses are easily transferable. And I think what also makes them very hard to erase. It's not something where a governor could just sign something necessarily and they would just be gone tomorrow. I remember being at AERA last year, and I was in a session that was very focused on ethnic studies across different time periods and stuff like that. And Pepe Aguilar, he was like, when they say CRT, what they really mean is ethnic studies. It's just people don't necessarily know the difference between them and they don't know what they're talking about, but that's what they're talking about. And there was something about that just shook me to my core because it was very true. And I think he said it in such a way that it just, I don't know, it impacted me in a way that I hadn't really thought about before. I think one of the things about it is there's very little that you could strip away from these programs because oftentimes these are programs that they're running off the backs of faculty who care. These are programs that aren't often organized within their own departments. They might be faculty sort of scattered throughout the campus who are making a commitment to come together to solidify a program so that students have more than one course that they could take. They have made sure that these courses are part of the core curriculum so they fulfill students' gen eds and they can transfer them very easily to four-year institutions if that's the path that a student's on. And so if you can't take away the money and they can still run these classes and stuff like that, then it becomes what do you have to take away? And in many ways, I feel like these faculty don't have a whole lot that they can lose. They have some of the protections of academic freedom. I think that these are courses that often fill in places like California. The legislature has codified that as part of the graduation requirements for high school and college, which I think is incredible and would love to see more states that do that. But I don't know. When you have nothing to lose, what can you take away? And I think that you have faculty members who come from an activist background. They are inherently and unapologetically political. They're ready to fight back for students' rights to these programs, to this knowledge. I think there's that, but also folks aren't really paying attention to community colleges in this vein. A lot of the time that I sit there and actually say, like, I study ethnic studies programs in community colleges, a normal response that I get is, wait, there's ethnic studies programs in community colleges? So this is also not who anti-CRT groups are thinking of. They're thinking of the UC Berkeleys, the UT Austins, the big flagship institutions that are well-funded and may have large centers and stuff like that. They're not thinking about their local community college.
Which is ironic because my best friend right now works at a community college, but also works for the Boys and Girls Club. And so gets students into college, but also has all these different pathways and building partnerships with community colleges. So like I think of like UC Berkeley right now that you mentioned, Berkeley City. They have an amazing like transfer program that we don't hear about. No one hears about. You know, if you go to Berkeley City and you take X, Y, Z, like they map it out for you. You take these courses and you're almost guaranteed a transfer into UC Berkeley. And there's so many different kinds of programs like ethnic studies and like math and sciences and stuff. And so it becomes like this cultural chisme of like, I'm going to show you like these pathways and ways to like navigate it so that we can outdo the system and play them at their own game. So while they're out there attacking or focusing on like large research, like schools and institutions, we're going to come up through another pathway that we've had to create because we've never been able to exist in these spaces, right? And so we've always had to like bust the side door open or sneak in through the window. And we're doing that. And we're doing that through these programs. And like the main program that comes to mind is the TAG program. There's so many like amazing schools that partner with community colleges. And they're like, if you take these courses, you're like a shoo-in transferring into these schools. They don't advertise it. You never hear about, oh, go to Berkeley City College or go to Kenyatta College and you can like transfer over to this school. But yeah, I think the profes in the community college are kind of like, we're not on your level. Like, we're not playing the same game that y'all are playing at the four-year institutions. We're like in the community with the students and we're connecting in a different way, which I think is so powerful. And that like we could learn so much from them and how they show up and how they show out for their students, right? Like for me, like I'm always like at my core, like what is my goal, right? Like what is my reason why? And I see like folks like my best friend Jaime who's doing stuff where it's like, yeah, we're going to talk about this. We're going to break down what this means. What does race look like, right? What does it mean to be poor? How does that intersect when we start thinking about like race and ethnicity and like all these other factors, right? And they do it in a way that's like, how do I get to you in your language and in a perspective that's going to make sense to you as opposed to like centering white logic? So I think that's powerful.
And Sergio, like what that makes me think of is like actually something that I would say is like the hurt. So there's all this rhetoric about how like it's divisive. It's teaching people of color to hate white people and all of that. It's not teaching them that. It's teaching them how to understand systems of oppression and how to understand the ways that those have impacted them and how to start to take those down or what have you. The few things that I hear that either students say or faculty say that like when they are working with Latinx students, these classes help them break down internalized racism, like a system that has taught them to hate themselves, that there's nothing about being brown that is worth being proud of. And it dismantles that, but then also says, who owns knowledge? Who legitimizes knowledge? Why is that a problem? Here are the messages that history books tell you about Black and brown people in the United States. And like, what does that mean? How are they portrayed? And like, how is that bull? And then it's about how do you get to these systems of power, these centers of power through education? And then how do you bring other people up with you? How do you uplift your community, your neighborhood, your family, what have you? And so that is it. Like it is about power. And who holds the power. And you can understand that to mean like knowledge is power, education is power, but also that navigational knowledge is absolute power.
I mean, you brought me right back to, I think the first time I took an ethnic studies course as an undergrad was also like right when I started in the McNair program. And I remember just like my head flipping over and over as I could finally see like the deficit narrative I was telling about myself and about my family in a way of all I could see myself doing was escaping. That wasn't what I was doing, right? I wasn't escaping. I was a product of, right, of so many positive things and so much strength that my abuelita had demonstrated and had done to guarantee our survival and our survivance, right? And before those opportunities, I couldn't see it because my entire narrative of the communities I lived in, history, it was sideways because it was told from a completely white perspective.
Which again goes back to the power dynamics, right? Like we've been across the country because we all were socialized in different spaces and places and contexts, but across the board, right? At the center of it all is white supremacy, right? And so understanding that like we have been othered, we have been socialized to believe that like if we don't exist in a certain way, that we don't matter. And that we need to like come up in such a way, right? Like even in my like upbringing, I think of like I'm first gen, right? So like going through the whole process, like I was doing it while I was figuring it out. And so like getting like my degrees, going through my like process, right? Like now, like as one of like the older cousins in my family, like they always like, oh, talk to Sergio. You want to go to college? Cool. Talk to Sergio. And so like the first thing I do is I'm like, let's take a community college course in ethnic studies. Take one. I did it with my cousin like 2 years ago and she was like, why? And I was like, because I want you to learn about yourself. Just like take one class and I will have no problem sitting with you on Zoom and like we can process like what's going on in your class if you feel like you're not getting it. But I really want you to take one class before you go to college. And now she's at UC Davis and she's like thriving and in her like element. And I'm like, that's what I was hoping for. And I was like, thank you so much because I was like, just take one class in ethnic studies to learn about yourself. Because I'm sure that your curriculum's not teaching you about yourself.
You know, when I think about like my undergrad or my grad, I mean, I took a number of Black history courses. I think what's really interesting is that the department that I came up from, like I was a history major, but like we didn't have any Mexican American or US Latina studies professors in that department at the time. Like he was old historian, like studied colonial Spain. And then we had a younger assistant professor who studied the history of Mexico, which are distinctly different fields of study. Like I didn't know ethnic studies was a thing until I was basically a doc student. And I was at a large Hispanic serving institution that offered this program. But like, it was just something that I didn't know that I could take it. But I often think about, you know, I was born and raised in El Paso. I have a white father, Mexican American mother. And Heather, to your point, a lot of the things in my family, like the fact that my mom is bilingual in that she can speak Spanish fluently. She knows that like reading and writing are like not her strong suits. And my brother and I grew up in an English only household. But like those were choices that my family was making to survive. There were very, very specific choices about not wanting children to grow up with accents, about like wanting children to be successful later on in life. And that took a very assimilationist approach to the ways that children were raised in my family. I get that. Like, I get that. But I think also like life would have probably been a lot less confusing if I had found ethnic studies earlier, because I feel like so much of some of the like Chicano studies literature that I found lets me know that like people were gaslighting me and telling me that I wasn't quote unquote normal, or that, you know, I wasn't Mexican enough or white enough, or like that this third space that I always felt like I was existing in like was actually legit. Just nobody validated that for me. And it took a long time for me to be able to claim that. And I think to undo a lot of my own internal confusion, my own internal racism, my own just trying to make sense of all of that. And so, you know, I think part of the reason why I get so passionate about community college and really just like undergrads, broadly speaking, in taking these courses is because I just think that there's a lot of content and knowledge that if I had gotten earlier, it just probably would have been super beneficial to me. Yeah. I got there eventually, but it probably took 10 years later than it needed to.
I absolutely resonate with that. Sure. Well, I'm going to invite you both to offer kind of any final takeaway you'd like. I was thinking about any final takeaways you have about preserving or protecting these types of sacred spaces for learning, but I want to leave that open. As you think about what that final takeaway is, I wanted to offer a quote that I wanted to bring into this conversation because it embodies so much of what I'm thinking and feeling right now about ethnic studies. So it's from Robin D.G. Kelly from Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination. He said, too often our standards for evaluating social movements pivot around whether or not they succeeded in realizing their visions, rather than on the merits or power of the visions themselves. By such a measure, virtually every radical movement failed because the basic power relations they sought to change remained pretty much intact. And yet it is precisely these alternative visions and dreams that inspire new generations to struggle for change.
I always think of the instructor who I think I quoted in my chapter at the end, who talked about just the fact that he had attained a PhD and was now teaching in a formal program in a community college, for him was a testament to the success of the Chicano movement. The fact that there are more Latina students going to graduate school, getting master's degrees, getting PhDs, and then becoming college instructors themselves. I think the heart of what I heard in that quote is that, one, I don't think there ever is an end game, right? Sort of the struggle for liberation. Like, is there ever an end game? I don't know. I don't think so within the current societal dimensions that we live in. That said, I think that just because progress is slow or progress, ends up looking differently than we originally imagined, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not a win-lose situation. There can be elements of both winning and losing. And I think the fact that ethnic studies is not just something for four-year institutions. It's not just for the most prestigious, most well-resourced institutions is a win. And I think that as I think about the future of ethnic studies and the kinds of things that I would love to see, I always come back to going to the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education, the AHI conference. And this was probably 5 years ago now. And there was a panel discussion with some various administrators, one who was a Chicano, who was the dean of a medical school in California. And one of the things that he said was how much he wished that pre-med students would not only major in biology, but they would like double major or minor in Chicano studies, because he felt like the Chicano studies gave meaning to what a medical degree could look like and what a medical career could look like for the betterment of communities. I've sat many, many times since I heard that and just thought, I would love, like if somebody would give me like $3 million and like 3 years to build a program that was a learning community of like pre-med students or engineers or something like that, where they had to take ethnic studies programs as well as their content information. And I would love to just see how that would play out for students. And this is not necessarily because like I have mixed feelings about STEM education in general, which if you know me, like we can talk about that offline. But like to me, like that would just open up, I think, so much of the creativity and the potential. And I think just demonstrate to folks the power of what ethnic studies could do in just giving that meaning to a profession or to a calling or something like that in a way that maybe nobody else has. So, if anybody's listening from like NSF or NEH and just wants to throw some money at me, I'll take it.
Please. I 100% agree, friend. So I wrote, like, as I was processing, I wrote that the personal is political, right? And so many people have said it. And I'm like specifically thinking about James Garcia. I think it was in like 2011 or 2014. I don't know if it was in the dossier for Joteria work, but in one of his pieces, he talks about how like the personal is political at this point, right? And so when we are like in these spaces, when we're doing the work that we do, like when I show up here, right? Because I'm at a religious institution and I talk about Joteria, like that's who I am, that's how I show up. All of me, right? Like I'm unapologetic about it. And I was like, are you sure this is what you're looking for, right? And at the same time, I'm in the same boat where I'm like, I don't know if there is like an end point, right? Because I think reflecting just on like my academic upbringing and journey and community, like I remember being like, I want to do work on Joteria and being told so many times that like, no, No one's going to be into it. It's not going to go anywhere. I had to go through those moments and those notions and me being like, I have to stick to what's near and dear to my heart, right? Like, this is something that's real, right? I can't sit in just queer theory because it still has, queer theory sits on the axis of power and privilege that doesn't speak to the community that I want to be engaged with and work for. And I look now and I'm like, look how much it has transcended, right? Even in just the last 10 years and being a part of it, I'm like, I feel hella grateful that like I'm a part of this process, but I don't want it to be like, that's it. I want it to be like, cool, the nuggets that I got from like the dossier that came out, right, in 2014 and from previous works. And I think of like Anzaldúa, right? And I think of like Lord, those are the people that like inspired me. I learned about them later in life too, because I went to school in New York and they didn't have ethnic studies per se, right? So it was just like I was taking courses in other fields and that's how I was like slowly learning. And I was in a similar boat, Erin, where I was learning about Ansaldúa and all these other amazing folks in like my master's and then like my PhD. And that's where I was like, oh, this speaks to me. This is where the personal became political. Or like, oh, I see myself resembled in this work. Now I'm even more inspired. I'm connecting to people. I'm like reaching out and writing with people, right? I'm like nerding out and doing all these things. And to me, I'm like, I'm one piece of this big puzzle. My goal is that like we need to continue to push like this work for the way that we show up, right? For like positionality, we need to show up for it in more and more spaces, and we need to continue to push that. Because if I go to like science spaces, they're gonna be like, who cares about positionality? It's like, well, I need to know why you're doing this, not just like this is what I'm doing. There has to be a why. And that's going to tie it in, whether you're a fourth grade student, whether you are getting like a PhD. Like when you know why, it changes and gives so much more value and meaning to what the hell you're doing.
You know what? In fairness to the scientists and the engineers in particular have taught me a lot in the last 2 years about writing positionality statements and like taking them seriously for publication. There are actually some engineering journals that require some pretty thoughtful, intentional positionality, which was a surprise to me, but a pleasant surprise.
Well, thank you both. I'm so glad I get to call you friends as well as colleagues. So thanks again for joining. And thanks to our listeners, whoever you may be, let us know. We're interested. And thanks for listening to OCCRL's Democracies College podcast. Please look out for the next episode, which will also build on the volume Critiques for Transformation, which is now available from Information Age Press or your preferred book vendor. So we'll talk to you again later this spring. Thank you. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.